Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to try to tackle a pretty meaty topic.
Yeah.
Really a significant program in federal contracting. It's the SBA's 8A Business Development Program. A lot of you out there listening, I'm sure, are familiar with it.
Right.
But we are going to really try to take a deep dive today into this program. And to do that, we're going to be relying primarily on a report from the Congressional Research Service, a CRS report, R47120.
Okay.
It's called the SBA 8A Business Development Program, Background and Legislative History.
Yeah. There's a lot there.
Yeah, so a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah,
And
all that history.
a lot of history. And I think we can all agree that,
Yeah.
in order to really understand how a program works today, and what the possible future for the program is, you really have to go back and understand kind of how it came about
Absolutely.
and why it was created,
Yeah.
and how it's evolved over time.
Yeah, and this report really does a good job of setting the stage. I mean, this isn't just another bureaucratic program. I think, you said meaty. I think that's a great word for it. There's a lot to this program in terms of understanding who participates in the vast world of government procurement. And, as you said, we're going to dig into how it's been transformed and what it looks like today.
Right, and the CRS lays out right up front kind of their purpose here, which is to help small, socially and economically disadvantaged business owners.
Yeah.
And I'm doing the air quotes there because we're going to get into how that is defined and how that has changed.
Yeah.
They want to help those business owners overcome barriers to participating in federal contracting,
Right.
and compete in the national economy.
Right.
So let's get into this.
Yeah.
What is the fundamental goal of this program? What are they really going after here?
So the fundamental goal of the program, I think, as is laid out very well by that quote, is really to level the playing field. We're talking about trying to create a more fair and equitable space in federal contracting. And for small businesses that have historically faced disadvantages, either because of social or economic factors, there needs to be some system, some program in place that helps them to participate in this very vast and very competitive marketplace.
Yeah, and they have some powerful tools in place to try to achieve that goal.
They do.
So what are some of the advantages?
Yeah. So I think the most obvious advantage is that you get preference, right? Contracting preferences. We're talking about the federal government here, right? Huge marketplace.
Huge spender.
Huge spender, yeah. And so the preferences come in the form of what are called set-asides, right? So contracts are set aside where the competition is limited to businesses that have that 8A certification. And then there are sole source contracts where an agency can directly award, just directly award a contract to an 8A participant without going through, a full competitive bid process.
Right. So it's pretty,
It's a big leg up.
it's a big advantage.
Yeah.
But it's not just about getting contracts, right? There's this whole other aspect of business development support. What is that about?
Yeah, that's a really key component that I think often gets lost when we're talking about the program. It's not just about getting you a contract. It's about providing assistance so that you can really develop your business to be successful in the long run, right? So that includes things like mentorship from other, seasoned business owners, training programs to kind of, beef up your skills, and counseling, right? Business counseling, all to help you develop your business.
And for how long can a business benefit from this kind of support?
Well, it has a 9-year limit. It's a 9-year program. 9-year program.
And that's to provide a meaningful opportunity for you to grow and develop and graduate to the point that you can compete without those preferences.
Yeah. Now, the report makes a really important point, and I think it's worth highlighting here that, getting that 8A certification, right? So you go through this whole process and you get certified. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're suddenly just going to be flooded with contracts.
It's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
It's not a guarantee.
The magic bullet.
It's not like you get certified and the work just starts flowing in.
Right.
You still have to compete. You still have to, put together good proposals.
Yeah.
Provide good services and, build those relationships.
So it opens doors, but it doesn't
Exactly.
guarantee anything.
Exactly. Opens doors, but it doesn't guarantee anything. And one thing to keep in mind is that ultimately agencies still have the discretion, right? They get to decide who they're going to award contracts to.
And 8A is a tool to help them meet their small, disadvantaged business contracting goals.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me a little bit more about how, kind of the mechanics of how it works. The SBA isn't just, uh, you know,
Right.
handing out certifications and hoping for the best. They're actually very, very involved.
Yeah, they play a real intermediary role.
Okay.
So other federal agencies, across the government
Mm-hmm.
will identify the things they need, right, goods and services.
Yeah.
And the SBA, acting under its Section 8 authority, will, accept those requirements and then subcontract that work to 8A participants.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
they're kind of the middleman.
Got it.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty sophisticated system, right? I
Yeah.
mean, this isn't
It's evolved over time, definitely.
right. And this isn't some new idea that's just sprung up overnight, is it? I mean,
Right.
the report indicates that these 1978 amendments that we're going to get into, they really they provided an explicit legal authority for something that had already begun,
Right.
through regulations. But why was that statutory authority so important?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things, right? I mean, one is, as you said, it did formalize something that had already been happening.
Right.
But I think maybe more importantly, I mean, if you go back to the Small Business Act,
Hmm.
we're talking about using the government's purchasing power to help small businesses. This has been an idea that's been around for a while.
Hmm.
And having that authority in statute, right?
Mm.
Not just in regulation, but in the Small Business Act itself,
Right.
provides a much firmer foundation.
Mm.
Regulations can change easily. This is a little bit harder to change, and it really does emphasize the importance, right? So the Small Business Act itself says that, the opportunity for full participation in our free enterprise system by socially and economically disadvantaged persons is essential if we are to obtain social and economic equality for such persons and improve the functioning of our national economy.
Yeah. So that language really gets to the underlying
Right.
rationale for the program, right?
Absolutely.
And then from there we get this specific statutory purposes, right, of the 8A program.
Yeah.
What are those exactly?
So the report lays out three, and they are to promote the business development of small business concerns owned and controlled by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals so that such concerns can compete on an equal basis in the American economy. So that's one. Two, promote the competitive viability of such concerns in the marketplace by providing such available contract, financial, technical, and management assistance as may be necessary. And three, clarify and expand the program for the procurement by the United States of articles, supplies, services, materials, and construction work from small business concerns owned by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals.
So it's
Yeah.
pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that it's not just about getting contracts. It's about fostering this development,
Right.
providing resources so
Yeah.
that these businesses can grow.
Okay. Now let's dig in a little bit to where this all started. It sounds like the 8A program didn't just kind of emerge from a single policy goal.
No, it's really the result of two separate but converging paths, policy streams.
Okay.
One is more generally aimed at promoting small businesses
Right.
in federal procurement, and the other one is specifically focused on addressing discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities
Okay.
in federal contracting.
Okay, so let's follow that first one first.
Yeah.
The efforts to support small businesses in general in federal procurement.
Yeah.
Where did those initial efforts begin?
So the report points to the Smaller War Plants Corporation, SWPC, going all the way back to World War II, 1942.
1942.
That was the first agency with authority to prime contract with the government and then to subcontract that work to small businesses.
Okay, so that model is very similar to
Very similar to the way 8A works today.
right. So the initial push to involve small businesses was really driven by the needs of war production.
Yeah, that's right. The idea was to use the productive capacity of smaller businesses to help the war effort,
Okay.
but also to provide some financial support to firms that were struggling.
Okay. Now, after the war, the SWPC was dissolved, but this idea of supporting small business through federal contracts, that didn't go away completely, right?
It didn't go away. It reemerged during the Korean War in 1951, and you saw the creation of the Small Defense Plants Administration, or SDPA.
Right.
And that had very similar authority to the SWPC. And then a really important development in 1953, the powers of the SDPA were transferred to the newly created Small Business Administration.
Okay. So the SBA, inherited
Right from the start.
right from the start this ability to contract with other agencies
Yeah.
and then subcontract to,
Yeah.
to small businesses, not just in times of war, but even in peacetime.
Exactly. And when the SBA was formally established in 1958 through the Small Business Act, that authority was codified. It was included in Section 8 of the Act. Although the report points out that it's interesting that in those early years, they didn't really use that authority. They focused more on, financial assistance,
Nice.
direct loans, and things like that.
Okay, so that power was there, but dormant.
Dormant, yeah,
Wow.
waiting for that second stream. Right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it was sitting there waiting for that second policy stream to really bring it
Yeah.
to the forefront. This idea of increasing participation from minority-owned businesses,
Right.
and it sounds like that had a bit of a different starting point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it did. The initial focus was on discrimination in employment, so by federal contractors, and this really begins kind of at the same time as the SWPC with Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 in 1941.
Okay, so what were the key provisions of that order?
It was a very important order. It prohibited discrimination by contractors involved in defense production based on race, creed, color, or national origin, and this really came about as a result of pressure and advocacy. Most notably by Philip Randolph, who had been, really highlighting the widespread job discrimination that was happening in the defense industry.
And that was really just the first step in a series of actions, right? I mean, there were more executive orders
Yeah.
that kind of built on that foundation.
Yeah, so you had, in 1943, Executive Order 9346,
Okay.
which broadened it. So no longer just defense, right?
Yeah.
All industries with federal contracts and subcontractors. And then throughout, the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson administrations, you saw these executive orders aimed at improving access for minority, racial, and ethnic groups to jobs,
Great.
to fair employment. And the CRS report has a really helpful table 1 that summarizes all these executive orders
Yeah.
and their provisions.
Okay, so for a long time, the focus was really on employees, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily the ownership of the businesses that were
Right.
getting the contracts. When did that begin to shift to supporting, minority business owners themselves?
So that shift really begins to take place in the late 1960s. And it's interesting because it kind of coincides with a period of great social unrest. You've got the civil rights movement. And there was this growing recognition that promoting business ownership within minority communities could be a real tool, right, for economic empowerment and
Right.
for addressing these inequalities. And so this is where you see the first real use of Section 8A in this way.
Right.
With President Johnson's President's Test Cities Program, or PTCP.
Right. So in 1967,
1967.
this is the first time that the SBA actually used its Section 8 authority to directly award contracts
Directly award contracts.
to firms that agreed to locate their operations in areas of high African American unemployment.
Right.
So it was very targeted, right?
Sure, targeted.
At trying to stimulate job creation.
Right. It's geographically targeted. It's saying we're going to use this tool to try to lift up these communities.
Right. But the report suggests that the program didn't actually
Yeah, it didn't quite achieve
meet its goals.
its goals. It was phased out relatively quickly. But it does signal a shift in thinking.
Right. Towards a more a more direct focus on minority business ownership,
Right.
as a policy objective, and
Yeah.
that becomes more explicit with the Nixon administration, right?
Absolutely. So President Nixon really, he launches this very clear policy of increasing minority firm participation in federal contracting.
Yeah.
And you have Executive Order 111458 in 1969,
Okay.
which launches the federal government-wide effort to promote minority business enterprises.
Okay.
He follows that up later in 1969 with a memorandum to all agency heads,
Okay.
really asking them to support this. And he creates a task force,
Right.
a federal task force on procurement. So you're starting to see the federal government really
Yes.
get behind this.
Yeah. So the executive branch is really pushing for this. How does the SBA use of Section 8
Yeah.
evolve during this period?
So you see regulations in 1970 that formalize the use of 8A to help disadvantaged businesses, to help them become self-sufficient and competitive. And then even a notice from the VA in 1971 says that agencies are channeling procurement to SBA for 8A subcontracting. And this notice also provides a definition of minority
Oh,
for these purposes.
right. So what are the specific categories that they lay out?
So they say Negro or Black, American Indian, Oriental, Aleut, Eskimo, Mexican American, Puerto Rican, Cuban, or of Central or South American origin.
Okay. And then the SBA follows up in 1973.
Yeah.
With its own definition of disadvantaged persons.
Yeah, so they define disadvantaged persons in the regulations, and it includes Black Americans, Spanish Americans, Oriental Americans, Eskimos, and Aleuts. But it's important to remember, and the CRS report emphasizes this, at this point, the SBA still doesn't have explicit statutory authority to focus 8A on these businesses. They're doing this,
Right.
Based on executive direction and their interpretation of the law.
Right, right. And so it brings us to the 1978 amendments.
Right.
Which really,
A watershed moment.
yeah, it really solidifies
Yeah.
the 8A program
Yeah.
as we know it.
Yeah, it gives them that solid legal foundation that they need.
Right.
To operate the program. And importantly, it's called, formally the Minority Small Business and Capital Ownership Development Program,
Yeah.
right there in the title.
Okay. So what specific authorities, did those amendments give to the SBA?
So it authorizes the SBA to enter into these 8A subcontracts
Okay.
with socially and economically disadvantaged small business concerns.
Okay.
And they define that
Right.
as small businesses that are 51% owned,
Okay.
at least, and
Yeah.
controlled
Right.
by one or more socially and economically disadvantaged individuals.
Got it.
They're also given explicit authority to provide all this assistance,
Okay.
financial management,
Right.
technical.
Right. So it's not just about
It's a real development.
it's not just about the contract. It's about developing the
It's about the business.
business itself.
Yeah.
Okay. And crucially, right, these amendments also address this really important question
Yeah.
of eligibility,
Right.
of who can be officially, recognized as socially and economically disadvantaged.
Absolutely. And this has been central to the program.
Yeah, and a source of much debate.
Yeah.
So let's break down that definition, that statutory definition of social disadvantage,
Okay.
as it was initially laid out in 1978. What are the key elements?
So it includes individuals who have been subjected to racial or ethnic prejudice or cultural bias because of their identity as a member of a group without regard to their individual qualities. And importantly, Congress makes specific findings in the law.
Okay.
So they're saying Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and other minorities are socially disadvantaged. So there's this idea now, right, that if you are a member of one of these groups, you are presumed to be socially disadvantaged.
Okay.
It's a presumption.
Presumption.
But it's important to note that Congress also says, well, the SBA can recognize additional groups, right?
Right.
Or even individuals as socially disadvantaged
Right.
if they meet the criteria. And so the SBA developed what's often called a three-part test
Okay.
to evaluate groups that petition, right,
Okay.
for this status.
Yeah. And so over time, the SBA did recognize additional racial and ethnic categories as warranting this presumption of social disadvantage.
Right.
So beyond the initial ones, what other
Right.
were included?
So eventually you get 5 broad categories
Okay.
that are recognized by the SBA as presumptively socially disadvantaged.
Okay.
So you have, Black Americans, Hispanic
Mhm.
Americans,
Mhm.
and Native Americans, and that includes American Indians, Eskimos, Aleuts, Native Hawaiians.
Okay.
And then you have Asian Pacific Americans added and subcontinent Asian Americans.
Okay.
And the report has a really helpful table 2
Okay.
that breaks down the specific countries of origin
Got
that
it.
fall into these categories
Yeah.
and how they were recognized. So was it regulations? Was it the 1978 Act?
Okay.
Was it a later law?
Right.
Or was it the result of petitioning the SBA?
Right. And it's really interesting to see how the understanding of this question of social disadvantage, how it evolved over time, right?
Yeah.
So between 1973 and 1989, we see that the initial inclusion of Oriental Americans,
Right.
they're omitted from the 1978 Act,
Right.
and then later you have the more comprehensive
Right.
recognition of Asian Pacific Americans.
Following lobbying and legislation.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting to see how that evolved, and it wasn't always smooth either. Right?
Yeah. Not
There
always.
were there were a lot of petitions.
A lot of petitions.
Yeah.
You have Hasidic Jews, you have women, you
Yeah.
have disabled veterans,
Right.
Iranian Americans. These were all groups that petitioned and were not accepted.
Okay.
On the other hand,
Right.
Asian Indians, Sri Lankans, Indonesians, they were successful.
Okay.
And even, within the recognized groups,
Mm-hmm.
you had some interesting happenings, right? Like with Tongans.
Right.
They were initially rejected, but later included
Right.
in the Asian Pacific American category.
Right. And throughout this period, the SBA also, put in place, rules and procedures for individuals to demonstrate that they had personally experienced social disadvantage,
Right.
even if they weren't a member.
Right. So if you weren't a member of a presumptively disadvantaged group,
Right.
you could still present evidence of
Right.
your own personal experiences.
Right. And conversely, they also had, mechanisms in place
Yeah.
to challenge or rebut the presumption of disadvantage
Yeah.
if someone was a member of a group, but they hadn't actually experienced social disadvantage.
Yeah, if there was evidence to suggest that maybe they hadn't actually faced that disadvantage,
Yeah.
there was a process for rebutting that presumption.
Yeah, yeah. And as we mentioned, right, the whole landscape of this has undergone a really significant shift
Absolutely.
very recently.
Yeah.
This 2023 court ruling. This is huge, right?
Huge.
So tell me a little bit more about the impact of Ultima Services Corp. v. U.S. Department of Agriculture. What happened there?
So in that case, the federal district court issued an injunction
Okay.
that basically stopped the SBA from presuming social disadvantage based on group membership,
Okay.
saying it was unconstitutional.
Okay.
And this really overturned, almost 30 years of SBA practice.
Yeah, I mean this was
yeah.
the way they had been doing it.
It was how they were doing it.
So what was the immediate impact?
So the SBA had to scramble.
Yeah.
Right? They temporarily suspended new applications. They issued guidance, and then they reopened the program in late September of 2023.
Okay.
And one of the key changes now is that even businesses and individuals who are already in the program and had relied on that presumption
Right.
now have to submit a narrative,
Good.
a personal narrative detailing their social disadvantage.
So regardless of your group affiliation, now
It's on the individual
it's on the individual
to demonstrate.
to show that
Yeah.
they've experienced this. So what kind of information is the SBA looking for in these narratives?
So according to their guidance, you need to describe your identity, your characteristics, and explain how you've been subjected to discrimination or bias because of those characteristics. And then very importantly, you have to describe two specific incidents,
Yeah.
incidents of bias that you've experienced
Yeah.
in areas of education, employment, or business that show that you've had chronic and substantial social disadvantage. And they've provided some resources to help people with this. They have a webinar,
Okay.
a written guide.
So they're trying to help people navigate this new world.
They're trying to help people, tell their story in a way that meets the requirement.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a huge change.
A huge
I
change.
mean, it's a really fundamental change to how social
It's
disadvantage
at the core of the program.
is established. Now
Yeah.
let's pivot to the other important element here, economic disadvantage.
Okay.
How was that initially defined back in '78?
So the 78 amendments define economically disadvantaged individuals as those socially disadvantaged individuals whose ability to compete in the free enterprise system has been impaired due to diminished capital and credit opportunities as compared to others in the same business area who are not socially disadvantaged.
Okay.
And it says that SBA is authorized to consider things like assets and net worth.
Right. Right. And so beyond just assets and net worth, what are some of the other financial factors that the SBA looked at
Yeah.
initially?
So initially it was pretty broad. They were looking at your personal financial condition,
Right.
Net worth, income, assets,
Right.
looking at access to credit and capital.
Okay.
Could you get a loan from a bank?
Yeah.
And then looking at the financial health of your business.
Okay.
Did it have access to credit and capital and markets?
Right. Right. So it was a pretty
It's pretty broad.
comprehensive assessment. When did they start to introduce these, more objective, quantifiable,
Right.
financial thresholds?
So that begins in 1989. They announced that they're going to implement these personal net worth requirements.
Okay. Expert speaker.